Thank you, everyone. Good morning on this beautiful, stunning November Adelaide morning. I'd like to begin, by saying who I am. I'm Julie Blanche. I'm the head of comms, which is great. I was just about to not introduce myself. I'm the head of comms for the Audit Office, and welcome. Thank you very much for making some time to come along today on this, our 13th ARC Chairs briefing. We've been doing this now since 2018, and we see it as a very important part of our outreach program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We acknowledge their living culture and unique role in the life of this region. And I was here in this room a couple of weeks ago listening to Kaurna elder Uncle Rob speak about how important education is to the Kaurna people and how Kaurna people would hold conferences regularly to share and learn, and I thought that was a really lovely thing to hear. And also that one of the rules of the conference is that no one person can speak twice until everybody has spoken. And I thought, what a great rule to bring back to all of our meetings. So I intend to implement that, and it just goes to show how much we can learn from sharing our traditional ways. I like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Since we last met, we've had a name change. We are now the Audit Office of South Australia, or as we're calling ourselves, Audit SA, increasingly. We think it reflects that we are a modern and contemporary audit office and proudly South Australian, which our previous title of Auditor General's Department did not, and was not very helpful at all in our dealings with our interstate and international counterparts. So we're very proud of our new identity. It also separates us from ministerially controlled departments and also from the Attorney General's Department, which we were frequently confused with. Also, since we last met, we've started publishing insights. I hope that you've had a look at some of our insights. We've published 2 so far, one in August and one in November, and we're talking there about findings from our reviews and just reflections on how sometimes the findings from one agency can be very important for other agencies to take notice of. And particularly ARC chairs are our target with that communication. So we hope that it's very useful to you. So far we've spoken about things like access to information, which we're getting some traction on, and also things like the SA Government's new procurement reporting arrangements. There'll be another Insights edition out in early 2025. Our relationship with ARC chairs is very important to us, and as I said, we see this as very important on our agenda. We will be sending something out to you soon to get your feedback on how these sessions are going for you and whether there's anything we can be doing that would improve them. But we feel that you rely on the assurance we give over our agencies' financial information and internal controls, and we value your oversight of agencies' financial reporting and risk management processes. And when the public sector sees that agencies are being independently audited and that an ARC is overseeing its operations, it builds trust and confidence in the agency's integrity and their risk management and their performance. And that's why this regular interaction is seen as very important to us. A little bit of housekeeping before the session. We'd really appreciate it if you could keep your mobile phones on silent. You'd know that we are recording today's session, and we will have that recording out to you in about a week or so. You'll also see that we have Grant from ASIO here with us today, and we're very pleased to have you here, Grant. Grant has asked for us not to record his session, so that won't be on the recording that you receive. While we've got a fairly full agenda, we want this to be as interactive as possible, so if you've got a burning question, put your hand up. We've got some roving mics that will help out, and there'll be opportunities to ask questions at the end of each session. And now I'd like to introduce Andrew Blasket, the Auditor General, for his introduction. For those of you who don't know Andrew, he started as the Auditor General in January this year. After a long career primarily in the Department of Treasury and Finance, across a broad range of policy and financial service delivery roles. His experience also includes senior roles in health and procurement. We're very lucky to have someone of Andrew's calibre running our organisation now. Andrew's passionately South Australian, and he's driven by making a contribution to South Australia being a great place to live and work. He's very pleased to be able to continue that work in his role as Auditor General. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Julie, and a warm welcome, particularly to those of you who are joining us for the first time, as well as those who are viewing the recording of this session. Thank you for the important work that you do on audit and risk committees. You provide the critical support to agency executive, CEs and boards in enhancing transparency, accountability and performance in your organisations. Our agenda today provides really an important opportunity to close out the year and provide some insights into what lies ahead. As Julie said, we expect to have morning tea around 10:40, which will be followed by a 30-minute panel presentation tailored to the interests of smaller entity audit and risk committees. We recognise that some of you are very busy and we're not expecting members from larger organisations to stay, but also you should feel free to stay because I think a lot of what we cover will be of broader interest. In my presentation, my brief presentation, I just want to share some reflections on my first year as AG and a glimpse of what we are planning for the future. As I said, as I come to the end of this first year in the role, it's a great opportunity to look back. It's been a year of achievements, challenges and learnings. In terms of achievements, since I came into the role, we've released 11 reports, including homelessness, green canopy, education management system, state finances, and of course, the important annual reports. We've achieved significant improvement in our access to Cabinet information, such that we're now receiving Cabinet approval pages for all submissions that we requested as part of the 23-24 audit, and we continue to work with DPC to streamline that process. As it stands at the moment, Cabinet clearance is still required for everything we ask for, so it's a long and drawn-out process. So as part of our normal operations, we will seek to have evidence of approvals under TI 8, TI 17. We go to the agency says, no, you can't have it. We then write to DPC. DPC then seek approval from Cabinet, or they batch them up and seek approval from Cabinet. So it can be up to 3 or 4 months before we see those approvals. So I look forward to working with the new head of DPC going forward on a better process for that, because ultimately it impacts how we do our work and how quickly we can turn around our opinions. We've had significant stakeholder engagement, both at the audit planning stage and as part of our strategic planning process, and I'll talk a bit more about our strategic plan in the coming slide. In particular, I'm indebted to the CEs of the agencies that you work with, who have been very supportive and very open to meeting with me and our staff in order to progress both our planning and our audit plan and our strategic plan. Importantly, an initiative commenced by my predecessor was approved by Treasury, which was to cease the levying of audit fees for the majority of general government organisations, and very importantly for performance audits. So we had the almost paradoxical situation where we would see an issue like homelessness, where work needed to be done in terms of a performance audit. That performance audit might cost up to $300,000. The agency would be asked to pay for that out of funds which would otherwise go into homelessness services. Treasury has, quite rightly I think, agreed to cease that practice. We will no longer be recovering fees for those sorts of audits. As Julie said, we changed our name, and it's been very well received, I think, by certainly our clients and internally. We've had a significant push in the area of communication, both internal and external. We started out a process where I did some internal comms each month, and I thought, the first one probably ran to 4 or 5 pages, and I thought, well, the next one won't be as long. But the reality is so much happens in our organisation in a month that each month those comms are still running to significant length. So clearly there's information to be shared and people are embracing that. Similarly, our communication to outside parties, to ARC chairs, to agencies has improved, I believe, and will continue to improve now that we've got a website which enables us to share that information more readily. We've got a lot to share. It's important that we get it out through that medium. We've also had a fundamental look at our report design, and we'll continue to look at that, focusing on particularly our performance audits, how we package up our information to get the message across to our key audience, which is Parliament. It's important that we are able to stick to factual, objective observations rather than emotive in our engagement with Parliament, and we're continuing to work with that. Had the interesting situation where we met with BFC, Budget and Finance Committee, last month, and 98% of their questions from their chair were emotive sort of questions. Will the Auditor-General confirm that the department is bad? That sort of questioning. We need to flick that on its head and get it towards the significant improvement messages in our work. So we've got a body of work to do there. In terms of challenges, new reporting requirements, particularly procurement reporting, was a significant challenge for us during the year, and we'll talk some more about that through the presentation today. Internally, staff turnover, particularly at the middle management level, stood at around 30% during the year. A significant impact for us, and one that you'll see when I talk about our strategic plan, represents a significant point of action for us going forward. It's a real challenge to us that we have a capped budget, so we don't reuse our fees. Our fees go to consolidated account. We have a capped spending budget, so we don't have the capacity to meet the salaries that are being offered by, in fact, your agencies in most instances. So we have level 6 auditors going out to agencies at level 8, and that's a real issue for us because we can't meet that. So we're going to have to look at other strategies to maintain experience and ensure that our audit quality remains high. Information timeliness continues to be a challenge for us. I spoke a little bit about challenges with cabinet submissions and how a delay in receiving cabinet submissions impacts our audit timing. Similarly, other agency information requests cause us very similar issues. So agencies, there's a tendency for junior staff in agencies to assume that we shouldn't have access to things just because we're not getting access to cabinet information. We're working very hard with agencies to address that. Most concerning for me, I think, in a lot of ways, is what I've started to see, or what I see now as Auditor-General, obviously. We issue, in the last year, we issued over 160 management letters to agencies, which is part of our ordinary course of business. Those management letters raised around 774 risk-based issues to be addressed. 304 of those were repeat issues coming through from previous years. In some cases, issues coming through from multiple years. 201 of those were high or medium risk, as assessed by us. Interestingly, 37 of them represented IT controls, and 32 issues related to forms of IT user access. Things that I believe can relatively simply be solved, but represent, from my perspective, a massive risk to access to core agency systems. So I think it's something that really requires further attention, and something that we'll be continuing to look at, how agencies are addressing those issues that we raise. And the last one there, and it really ties back to the staff turnover, is our funding model continues to be a constraint on the work that we do. Under the legislation, I'm required to do financial statement audits. I don't have a choice. There's 160 agencies that require that work. I'm not required to do performance audits, and yet performance audits are the thing that Parliament, in a lot of ways, is most interested in. So there's an expectation that we do that work, but essentially we don't, as we have to put more of our funding into financial statement audit work, we're being crowded out of the performance audit work. So that's a discussion I'll be looking to have with Treasury in the coming year. What we learned. Well, we learned a lot. Our audit report runs to over 500 pages in terms of our annual audit report, and there's so much valuable information in there. What I'm increasingly learning is that we need the opportunity to share those learnings more broadly and on more occasions than just at annual report time. And that's why we're using this new Insights tool or Insights opportunity to get messaging out. There's strong interest in our improvement recommendations outside of principal agencies, so we'll be packaging all of that information up for general consumption. Stakeholder expectations are such that they're looking for no surprises, looking for us to tackle issues early and early stakeholder engagement on complex matters. When I spoke to you earlier in the year, I said we were starting the process of putting together our 24 to 27 strategic plan. The final plan was released to staff early last month, and it was the product of significant internal and external engagement. Our mission has largely remained unchanged. We want our audits to make government more transparent, trusted and valued. For me, that can be simplified as simply making government better. We want to make government better. Our work for the coming 4 years really distills down to those 3 goals you can see there. Maximising our value by engaging effectively, retaining and recruiting great people, and investing in new ways to do our work so it's efficient and effective. Rather than go through the whole strategy, I really just want to focus on those two goals at the bottom in terms of investing in engagement activities that build strong working relationships and sharing our knowledge and insights with state and local government clients, because I think they're the ones that probably mean the most to the people here today. In terms of sharing knowledge, I've already spoken about insights and updating our internet. Our focus in the first instance is getting that information out to you guys as members of ARCs and ARC chairs, but by virtue of the fact that we've put it on the internet, it's freely available for all agency staff, etc., and we will continue to push that out to anybody who wants to read it, because ultimately it's those powerful messages that come through in all our reports. They're already in there. It's digging them out and sharing them more widely. In essence, this was just a short glimpse of our plan, and I expect we will have the full plan available, a one-page version of our plan available on the internet post-Christmas, and we'll certainly be pushing that out through the Insights forum. I won't take up any more time. We're very fortunate to have Grant from ASIO with us. Certainly some of us heard from Grant earlier in the year, and he has a very powerful message. As Julie said, because of the nature of the things he plans to share, Grant has asked that we not record his part of the presentation, and I will also ask that you also not record or photograph any aspect of Grant's presentation. Grant is an Assistant Director with ASIO, and he's going to talk on the security environment and foreign interference. He has said that he would welcome any of your questions, and in fact, this sort of presentation is far more powerful, in fact, if he can get engagement and questions from you. So without stringing it out any longer, I'll hand you over to Grant.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Daniel O'Donoghue. Daniel is the head of our FA branch, so he looks after all of our financial audit teams and does a lot of very important work around controls, risk, and we put out a lot of very helpful information through management letters to agencies, and a lot of that comes through Daniel. So he's going to share with you some of the important findings from the 23-24 audit year. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everyone. So probably a more familiar story than the one that you've just heard. But I guess just to start off with a quick summary of where we're up to with the 2023-24 reporting. So as most of you would know, our annual report has the larger agencies in. There's around 50 of those. After we finish that, we move on to the majority of other agency financial statement audits, and then that just keeps rolling through calendar year and back into agencies again. So that has all worked relatively well for this year, but if I summarise, probably the key change we saw for 23-24, we had 22 modified audit opinions so far. We're still doing some of the 23-24 audits, and they all related to modifications for the procurement reporting requirement that came in this year. We've talked previously about that was a complex requirement. It's not straightforward. That played out as we went through year end. And I think one of the questions that has come back to us out of that process was, what's our approach been to that audit? Did we take a particularly different view? And the answer to that is no. We looked for material accuracy. It's just that it was a complex requirement that a number of agencies couldn't quite get to that point of it being materially right. The other question that's been asked is, does that mean that the agencies who didn't get a modified opinion got it absolutely 100% right? No, definitely not. They had issues, but they weren't material. So in terms of outcomes, the other thing, we consistently have a couple of large insurance agencies where we have an emphasis of matter just to highlight the risk around that, but that's an ongoing thing for us and for them, and nothing to be too fussed about. Other than that, we're still working through some remaining agency audits at the moment. In terms of the whole of government controls opinion, the other thing that we put out each year, because we're required to, as Andrew was saying earlier, we don't get a lot of choice about the work that we do. So that opinion was not modified for 23-24. It was modified last year for access to, or not having access to some of the cabinet information, as Andrew talked about. That has progressed quite positively this year, which is really good because it means that we can essentially move past a compliance requirement to focus on the more significant issues from our perspective that agencies actually have some control over. So while we didn't modify the opinion, there are some, I guess, common themes and some significant issues that came out that we highlight in that report. They're very similar themes to what you've probably seen or heard us or others talk about in the past, the 6 boxes that you can see on the slide there, but they are all areas where a significant amount of money is spent or where they relate to significant assets. So if I start with contract management, it's a very familiar topic. It happens in pretty much every agency to differing levels. You might engage somebody to do an activity on your behalf. You might engage somebody to provide a product to help you to achieve your outcomes. Really important that there are regular discussions, ongoing meetings with those suppliers to make sure that that process is on track. Doesn't, unfortunately, always happen, which means that sometimes things do go off track and that's not picked up early. And contractors aren't always motivated to organise those meetings. If they're getting paid and things are going well, they might, from their perspective, they're not going to be knocking on the door to make sure that there's a discussion about how they're performing, which links to the next point about KPIs. They're in pretty much every contract. They have KPIs. There's a lot of work's gone into setting them up so that the contract can be managed well. Only works if we actually monitor and discuss those as we're going through the contract process, and we continue to find that that doesn't always happen. The last point on this slide about key documents being in place and complying with the requirements of various frameworks, I've listed Procurement SA up there. It sounds like a basic thing, and it should be, but it doesn't always happen. We continue to find instances where that's not the case. So moving from contract management through to procurement. Again, it's an area we focus on. There's a lot of money that gets spent every year, new contracts. Those contracts are set up for a number of years, so it's important that they're set up to run well. We still find instances where TI requirements more generally haven't been followed, procurement SA requirements which are in TI 18 haven't been followed, or there's other disclosure requirements around contracts on tenders and contracts websites, etc. So they're all things that we find. The key point with those, I guess, for me to point out this year, if you're not complying with elements of TI 18, so the procurement requirements, that's also a breach of the TIs that you need to report to DTF. There's a couple of instances we're aware of this year where that didn't happen. The next point on the slide is a fairly basic one. You should have documentation. It has to be available. It's a basic point. It's pretty common to everything that agencies do. But again, we still find instances where that's not the case. And it should be consistent documentation. If your, I guess, approach to market says you're going to take a particular approach and you're going to go out to market to an open market call, and then the purchase recommendation says something completely different and there's no documentation that's been signed off that explains why, then that's a basic problem with how the process has been run. But again, we do still see that. Likewise, with the bottom point there about conflicts or potential conflicts, we just ask that there's evidence of how they've been managed. Not always the case that we can find that will be provided with it. Asset management, whether it's an agency doing it itself or it's done through the Cross-Government Facilities Management Arrangements, or AGFMA, because it's easier to say, it is about the management of public sector assets, and they're worth billions of dollars collectively, so it is an important area. Not having accurate records of those assets or their condition or your maintenance plans for them, if those things aren't there, it's very difficult for anyone to conclude that the assets are being managed effectively. But that's what we continue to find for some assets at some agencies. So it's really important to have good records in place, especially if you've outsourced any of that activity to contractors, because if you, like with any other part of contract management, if you don't have good documentation, you can't hold them accountable for what they're supposed to be delivering very easily. The final point on here around the AGFMA, so that is an outsourced contract with Ventia as the provider. Are managing that contract. We know through our work that DIT are working very hard to improve that process. There are still a lot of issues. Two really important points. Agencies are still responsible for their assets, and agencies get the invoices from Ventia for the work that they have done. They need to be reviewed fairly carefully to make sure that you're paying for work that's actually been done. We're aware anecdotally of instances where that hasn't always been the case. Staff, obviously there's a lot of people that state government employs, so we spend a fair bit of time looking at controls around that area. The first point on this slide about working with children checks or aged care checks, basic things that should be in place where you have people working for you who work with vulnerable populations. But we continue to find instances, and I'm not talking about just one or two, every year, where that's not the case for people who are working with those groups. They don't have those checks in place before they start work. The second point on here, they don't always have a contract in place before they start work. Seems like a fairly simple thing to have sorted out before somebody starts working for you, but it's not always what we find. And the final point there about key payroll processing controls, it's a basic thing. We need to be making sure that people are paid the right amount for the work that they do, but it is still something that we find issues with each year. Looking forward, I guess, from this point, procurement reporting, it was a very bumpy ride for the large agencies who had to do that this year. As we said, there's a number of modified opinions there. Good news on this front for a smaller agency, you don't have to apply these requirements until 2026-27, so that's a happy place to be if you're a smaller agency. That doesn't mean you don't do anything now, it means start thinking about it now, because it's the experience from 23-24 is that the more work you do to have your systems and processes in place, the happier you will be when you have to comply with these requirements. For larger entities, it was a bit of a bumpy road. This year doesn't have to be the same. You've got the opportunity to learn from what happened, and most agencies who went through that have things that they will change. From our perspective, we'd like to see what has changed earlier rather than right at the end of the year, which we all kind of got caught with last year, so that we're all on the same page before we get to that requirement at year end. The other one that I just want to mention coming into 24-25, asset valuation. We wrote to agencies in May and said, look, there's an annual requirement to review your asset values. Most agencies did really well with that, worked quite well through year end. So that's really good. It is an annual requirement, so something has to happen this year and as well. The other thing with that, learning from 23-24, if you're caught towards the end of the year and you need a valuer, they are very hard to get in the July to end of September period. They're already busy. They don't have time to take on extra clients. So plan for that early. We're also hoping that there'll be some better news that we can share with people around what the Valuer General might be able to provide to help out agencies in those intervening periods. We've had some very positive preliminary discussions, but we're just working through that with DTF as well. And the last point to be aware of, there have been some small changes to AASB 13, which is the main standard that sits under valuation. If you're revaluing this year, that may have an impact. It's not 100% clear around the country how much of an impact it may or may not have, but it's just something to be aware of. as you work through that this year. So with that very quick run through those things, I'm happy to take any questions now or in the break or whenever. Otherwise, I will hand over to Salve Bianco to talk through our performance audit area. So Salve heads that area. He's the one responsible for making sure that that works. And as Andrew said, that is an area that reviews things in more depth than we do through our normal work. So Salve will give you a little bit of an overview of what his team have been doing. So.
Hello everybody, I'm sure you're all jumping for joy that we're not going to boo you anymore and you'll be welcoming us with open arms now when we do the next performance audit. So today I'll be covering two things. First off, we released a report in July about homelessness services, so I'm just going to briefly touch on some takeaways from that report, and then I'll quickly talk about what some of our upcoming reviews are going to be in the future. So first off, managing homelessness services. Look, we released that report to Parliament in July. We looked at whether Housing Trust was effectively managing the provision of these services. I won't be stepping through findings and recommendations. I really just wanted to cover a couple of areas and see if anything might be useful to you guys in your role as an audit committee role. So first off, monitoring and evaluation. Look, in an agency that's delivering significant and critical public services or initiatives, we think that measuring and reporting on outcomes is an essential part of the function, and it does demonstrate whether intended outcomes are achieved, and it does allow evaluation of the service or the initiative. So this is usually referred to as a monitoring and evaluation framework. Such a framework also allows outcomes data to be used, to inform strategic actions and looking at continuous improvement, factors like that. So a lot needs to be done to ensure the framework is operational. So some of the things that we found was essential was identifying data sources, establishing baselines and setting targets for all outcomes measures, and collecting the required data and using this data to monitor and report on outcomes. It's a significant task and it can be complex and lengthy process. Look, chapter 5 of our report, if you want to read it, it's in there. We talk about it a little bit further. We also have explored this a little bit in our past reports. So we've looked at access to mental health in the past and managing gambling services, and I think gambling harm, and there's some elements in there that we've covered as well. Briefly on outcomes measures, look, what we found was performance measures to be useful, and I know everybody knows this, you have to follow SMART principles. Some things we looked at, we found was useful to think about with performance measures is they often didn't include enough information to understand what success looked like. So many of the outcome statements are written using terms such as fewer, increased, improved, better, without stating the baseline or to be using the level or amount of expected services. Further, we didn't, sometimes it didn't detail how the outcome will be measured or the time frame to achieve the outcome. So it's very difficult to measure whether a service was effective without those in mind. We also thought it was mindful to be aware of the differences between an outcome and an output. Look, outputs are important because they're the tangible products or services or deliverables from a program, but they don't give you a measure of the impact or change a program achieves due to the outputs, and that's the outcome measure. So we thought that was really important to consider. And finally, look, you shouldn't underestimate the data and system requirements of running a monitoring and evaluation framework. You need a properly configured system to collect relevant, timely and reliable data. And for some of those complex service areas, you're also collecting qualitative and lived experience data, so that needs a pretty good system to be able to capture all that. So that covers that side of it. The other area we've concentrated on in managing homelessness services is contract management. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Most agencies of government utilise service providers to assist to deliver services and initiatives. And some of the things that came up in our review that we're just going to share with you today is three things, those three things on the slide there. Look, contract design, we observed that it's important to get the contract design right to ensure that you can monitor the outcomes, and that has to be right at the beginning when you're establishing those contracts. Things like intended outcomes have to be tailored and specific to the services provided under the contract, and they have to align with your framework. So you can see some links there to your actual outcomes framework. And we felt you needed to make sure you develop performance measures for all outcomes identified. You've got to check that through, and that they're relevant and measurable. And in the contract has to have clear measures of success in the contract. Has to be defined in the contract itself. With contract performance management, a few things that we noted when overseeing contract performance, just some observations there. It was really important to hold the regular performance meetings with the contracted service providers, and that allowed you to give timely feedback and promptly inform them of any performance issues, and we thought that was a critical element. Conducting regular performance contract reviews we thought was also important, and ensuring service providers develop and implement corrective action plans for areas where targets haven't been met or KPIs haven't been achieved. That's hard work, but that's the core of the contract management process. And also looking at process to measure and report on KRIs, key result areas in contracts, trying to get that sorted so you have the regular reporting. And then finally, just some observations on contract management plans. Look, for any significant contracts, it's important that contract management plans are established that identify the contract manager and their responsibilities. This is fairly basic stuff, but it's worth thinking about. And some of the things you need to be clear about is the monitoring and performance to ensure contract outcomes are achieved, managing, addressing and escalating contract performance risks, identifying and addressing opportunities for continuous improvement as part of that arrangement, and also reporting to the internal stakeholders as required. So the agency is aware through the governance process about what's happening. Once again, if you want further details, they're in Chapter 6 of our report, if you feel like reading any more on that. And so that's all I was going to cover today on that. I've got to acknowledge that Housing Trust put a lot of effort into developing their framework. They're just not there yet, but it's a multiple-year effort to get it right, and you've got to work out what sort of service you're going to do it for. But for critical services, you've got to have some idea of what your outcomes are, and you can't do that unless you're measuring it. So that's probably the message there. So I'll briefly be covering now just some upcoming reviews that we're doing. So we've got obligations under the Passenger Transport Act to review and report on procurement processes when passenger transport service contracts are awarded. The government awarded contracts for regional bus services Phase 2 in late October 2024. So you may recall we reported on Phase 1 in January 24, and I've talked a little to you guys last time about some procurement principles that came out of that. So we'll be reporting on that one in March 2025. The other one that we are in the middle of working on in the moment is SAMRE 2, which was a project to establish Australia's first proton therapy unit. So our focus for this review is the state's involvement in this arrangement. So we intend to provide a status update report to Parliament in the first half of next year, and that will really include things like what the project arrangements are that the state has spent and committed to the project, some information on some of the state's exposures and how the SA government's managing those exposures. So that's going to be by the mid-year next year. That's the aim for that. The other interesting one we've had some involvement in and we've started the audit on is Aboriginal Education Strategy at Department of Education. Look, we're looking at just seeing how they're managing that strategy and how to achieve their intended outcomes, and we're going to cover things like planning, outcomes, performance measurement, and reporting and evaluation. So this is another one where we're going to be looking at some of the outcomes frameworks that they're using and how they're managing those. Look, interesting part of this review is that we engage an external contractor to advise us on culturally sensitive matters as part of the audit, and also just to share experiences and knowledge of cultural awareness with our performance audit team. So we're really looking forward to that work and looking forward to get some good insights there. And finally, local government contract management. So we are currently halfway through a review of contract management at 2 councils in local government. We're looking at areas such as risk management, performance management, contract variations, and contract extensions and renewals. So we've got a pretty full program, and look, hopefully some of those will be some things we can pull out in future sessions that we have here as well. And that was really it from me today, unless there was any questions. Now I'll ask Andrew Corrigan, who's Head of IT, Audit, to come along and have a talk.
Okay, I'll be quick because I know this is morning tea time, which is the best time of the day. So in the past, my topic was on ICT project management, and I have actually discussed different ICT projects in the past in this forum. Usually it's about a particular project that we're looking at, and in the last presentation we did here, I talked about the education management system. So we regularly look at whether or not projects are on time, on budget, and with the required functionality. And in doing this presentation, I went through all the different audits we've done in terms of ICT projects and looked at all the main themes. And then I also looked at some of the interstate audit reports. And then finally I looked at, and I noticed that there was a whole lot of common themes that came across why some projects have challenges. And then I went on Copilot, which is an AI tool, and I put that question in as well. And basically I could have saved myself several hours because it actually summarised some of the main reasons why ICT projects have some challenges. I'm conscious of time, but essentially it talked about having lack of clear vision and goals, inadequate project management practices, shifting business goals and priorities during the project life cycle, insufficient communication among team members and stakeholders, lack of stakeholder engagement and feedback, underestimating the required resources, both in terms of budget and manpower, and vague project scope leading to uncontrolled changes and budget overruns. So that was, more detailed amongst those headings, but essentially most of the projects that we look at experience some of these challenges in some shape or form. One thing that Copilot didn't mention, and I actually didn't think about in my initial summation of all the different courses, was the role of the vendor, and if you use a business integration specialist, etc. So a lot of, when we looked at the education management system, for example, they said they had challenges during COVID in terms of getting resources and things like that. But that wasn't just related to internal resources. The vendors also had challenges getting sufficient resources to apply to these projects as well. So although it's covered under insufficient resources, I think the role of the vendor does play can play a big role in why some projects may have some challenges. And also in terms of how you define the amount of resources that you're going to need. The reason I say that was in a prior life before I was an auditor, I was involved in ICT projects for several banks. And my very first project was putting in an intrusion detection system. And when I spoke to the vendor, they said, this system will integrate with this IDS system. This is all you need to do. So I got the funding and defined a business plan, etc. And as soon as I actually bought the product, then I realised actually they wouldn't actually accept the alerts that come in from our system into their system, and then we had to build some middleware. So sometimes vendors, in trying to get the business, can sometimes be a bit more optimistic about what needs to happen, and that can really impact the time and the budget, etc., of all the different projects. And one thing I have noticed with government is that we tend not to, and I'm generalising here, we tend not to hold the vendor to as much account as it should have. That's something that I've kind of noticed is where once they've got the business, they tend to forget about some of the promises that they made. Okay, so in terms of tips to resolve the ICT project failures, this is also listed from Copilot, but it was also in the same things that I had, which was like establishing clear goals and a detailed project plan, using project management tools and methodologies like Agile or Scrum, aligning project goals with business objectives and maintain focus, regularly review and adjust priorities as needed, foster open communication channels within the team, engage stakeholders through regular updates and feedback sessions, and accurately estimate and allocate necessary resources. That's probably a key one. and also ensuring continuous monitoring and adjustment of resource needs, and defining a clear project scope and stick to it. In the case of the education management system one, which was on the very first slide, there was trying to define what was the mandatory requirements with the EMS system did actually delay a lot of the project. So in terms of what this means for an audit risk committee, I typed in Copilot. How can audit and risk committees help success with ICT projects? And it came up with these main headings. But essentially it was helping committees should be able to help identify potential risks early in the project life cycle. They can also help ensure that ICT projects comply with relevant laws, regulations and standards. And they can help ensure that the ICT project aligns with the organisation's strategic goals. That's a critical one. Should the project even occur in the first place, and is it going to meet the needs of the agency? Also, committees can help establish performance metrics and regularly monitor the progress of ICT projects. This helps in identifying any deviations from the plan and taking corrective action promptly. And committees can oversee the allocation of resources, and they can also encourage regular audits to occur, which will help address, hopefully highlight and address any issues that the project's experiencing. I kept it brief because it's morning tea. Does anyone have any questions? It's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Copilot. We're running a little bit behind, I'm sorry, but we will break for about 15 minutes now. We know how important it is to network, and I heard a couple of people saying, oh, I see you twice a year here. So it's really great that people sort of lock this into their diaries and see it as a great opportunity to mix and mingle as well. So if we could be back at our seats in 15 minutes, that would be great. It's eating in a little bit to our session after the break, which is directed at small agency issues, but I think will also be relevant to those of you who are working with larger agencies. So we'd love you to stay around. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. I'm going to try something different. I haven't done this forum before. They're shaking his head. I'm going to embrace my inner Michael Parkinson, Graham Norton, or and discussion. Please joining me. Deborah has expensive. Very cheap, really. Extensive experience in state government and finance, business and leadership roles. Throughout her career, Deborah is also a range of 2010. Now, Director Accounting. Analyst. First question. What experience?
Thanks, Andrew. There are a lot of things that are the same for across all the audit and risk committees, and they tend to have a pretty consistent approach, which is supported by the work of the Auditor General and many of the regulations that we work under. Smaller agencies, obviously, there is there's always a resource issue. There's resource issues in both areas, but for smaller agencies, I think some of the very large across government risks that all agencies have to deal with can be really quite a challenge. I'm talking about cyber, fraud, information security. You'll see those in most audit and risk workloads, and to deal with something, I mean, we had the briefing from the man without the second name today, to deal with things like cyber for a really small agency and to have that externally reviewed and then to deal with the recommendations can be really challenging when you've got a really small team. And the other difference, there's two other differences. One is you often have people doing multiple roles. They're doing the procurement, they're doing the finance, they might even be doing payroll. And then so you get that segregation of duty finding, and it's really difficult to do anything with that. But on the plus side for small agencies, you do often have a direct line of sight or direct responsibility or accountability to the CE, whereas in the larger agencies, you've got what I call like the tribes, and they're all out there, they're business units, and they have their own even cultures and their own boards sometimes, or, you know, their own business unit leader. And to find out what's really going on in those far-flung provinces is really difficult, and it's a bit easier in a smaller agency.
We've obviously heard from Deborah some of those challenges in terms of small agencies. You've got the unenviable task in a lot of ways of marrying government policy with, of course, robust and always improving financial management policy. What factors do you take into account when developing those policies, particularly for small agencies, and scope do you have for differential policy?
I was just looking into the audience, and there's a couple of members that have previously done my role. So some of these aspects, I think sustain the test of time. There's always this, this challenge of balancing what the government wants, what agencies' preferences are, and the considerations that we consistently look to, and what agencies are telling us overwhelmingly is we want to understand the policy intent, right? What is it the challenge that you want to solve? What is it that, the outcome that we want to achieve? Because more often than not, what we found is agencies want to work with us around policy design, but also more importantly, how do we implement this in a sustainable and in an effective way? So, first and foremost, that policy intent to inform, good policy design. And then there are other things, around the use of language, what mechanisms, you apply. We've got some flexibility around that. But I think most importantly and more recently, the way that we engage with agencies has been really critical to the outcome. So, early engagement and understanding not just the size of an agency, because I think what Deb referred to, agency size, small agencies can be easy in some respects because of their governance, because of the nature of their business, but some can be really complex, and some large organisations, can be quite complex, or they can be better resourced. So sometimes the size of the agency doesn't always determine the impact, and understanding that impact is really important, and not just assuming what we know centrally, and we quite often engage with Audit Office, but understanding that agency impact through early engagement, and also ensuring that we consult with a variety of agencies in terms of complexity, size, nature of the business, and as it's relevant to the policy that we're trying to design. But in terms of, differential policy, I mean, we've got the ability to have transitional arrangements. We've got the ability to apply certain reporting requirements, tier 1 versus tier 2. But what we're finding, Andrew, is that agencies are interested in almost the support and the wraparounds that come with policy implementation. So things like guidance, early advice from audit, and and so we take into account a range of things.
This one's louder. That's a great segue over to Daniel. When it comes to planning and conducting our statutory audits, do we approach small entities differently, or do we pick up more on the risk and complexity factors that Fung's just talked about?
Yeah, I guess for the risk and complexity, we do look at the small agencies differently. So as Deb mentioned before, you can't have segregation to the same degree in a small agency. We wouldn't expect that to be there. So it's about looking at it. What is the risk related to the agency that we're looking at? How material are things for that agency? So we do have a different view for that. Now, we still run into issues where we might view that there still needs to be a little bit more separation or a different governance arrangement in place. But it is something that we work through, and we do try and make the recommendations as tailored as they can be for the agency that we're looking at. Doesn't mean that we always get it right, but that's the intent, because we understand we're dealing with a different organisation and they've got different challenges, as we've already sort of talked about a little bit. They've got different resourcing, they've got multiple sort of roles being done by one person. That does make some of the things that we typically look at quite challenging, but we do certainly take that into account in the work we're doing.
Excellent. Fung, you started to talk about some of the sort of supports that are available to smaller entities and less complex entities. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think in smaller agencies, you don't have, I guess, necessarily the networks that sometimes some of the larger agencies have, and the opportunity to brainstorm, to leverage ideas and share material and documentation. I think we've got lots of examples where smaller agencies are wanting some guidance very early on from Treasury and also from Audit. And so, those supports, certainly through my branch in Treasury, but, more so across Treasury and with Audit. And I think one of the things that Daniel, Ian and I have really worked through in the last year is ensuring that agencies really understand our roles and the supports that we can provide. I think I can say here that agencies can sometimes shop around for advice, and we get that. I've been there, and so it's important that there is consistent support and consistent advice coming out of the two central agencies.
Okay. I think there's an opportunity, obviously, with the panel here to throw it open to the floor if there are any questions.
Thank you for this session. I think it's been useful. I wonder if you could comment on your experience with the level of management understanding and experience when dealing with external boards and in particular audit and risk committees.
I can make the initial comment, but I'm sure others on the panel would also comment. Look, I think where an audit and risk committee sits in an agency does vary a lot from agency to agency, and Daniel's nodding, so that's good because he goes to lots of meetings. When you first start on a committee, it actually takes you quite a long time to, first of all, really work out where the committee sits and how seriously it's being taken in the agency. It actually takes you quite a long time just to come up to speed with the different ways papers are presented, and you are often dealing with audits that have happened in the past before you've joined the committee and you've still got action items. One of the things I struggle with on some committees that I've been on is how long it takes audit actions to be dealt with, and that definitely does vary from agency to agency, and it's a cultural thing. And Andrew mentioned in your opening about the repeat findings, the bona fide finding that we have every year, and it's really frustrating to just go over that again. And I do think that goes to the heart of the very question, which is how seriously do management take some of these findings. I always sort of try to keep the sights high in the committee so that we're not just going through the process of a compliance process. It is obviously a compliance process, but it's also, I think, an opportunity to assist management by having independent people get a bit cross about why are we still looking at this from 2018, which there are still some from 2018. And often actually that is the smaller agency has some audit finding that's a really big picture thing that can only be fixed when the system's upgraded. So that audit finding sits there for forever and ever. So I think, that's the challenge for members of audit and risk committees to first of all get a read on the culture of how seriously this is being taken. Is it just a process and a committee we've got to have, oh my God, it's audit committee time, we've got to do X, Y and Z? Or is it something where the CE and the leadership think, no, this committee can really help me get some things done that I want to get done?
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that it's one of those things that you see different approaches within agencies, and I think the strength comes from having the independent members of those those committees challenge some of the things that may have been there for a while. So if you've got, whether it's management or it's just the way that an agency has been working, the strength of having somebody external come in and ask a question about, well, hang on, why is it being done that way, whether it's the audit findings or whether it's just how something is being managed. I think that's one of the key strengths, and in the roles that you have on committees, that's one of the opportunities you have to really bring the external experience that you've had to how that organisation, whatever its size, is being run, and to challenge some of those things to help with the overall governance.
That would certainly be my experience as well. We're very lucky to have Deborah as chair of our own audit office audit committee, and the value for me in that is having those external eyes ask the questions. Why do you do that? Is this important to you, etc. So it's very valuable.
Andrew, I think one of the areas that I've seen which is a strength in the way that management and committee members interact is a good understanding of the matters which belong to management versus those that belong to the audit committee. We often have, it's almost like a fundamental question right up front, right? But time and time again, I see management responsibilities in the terms of reference of, audit committees and so, when you don't have that foundation piece right, there's a bit of tension there. So, that's something I think is worth considering.
Lovely. Thank you for that question.
Hi, Robert Chua from Department of Energy and Mining. Thank you for organising today's event. It's very useful in sharing information. My question is, technology is quite pervasive, as we all know. It's been around for a long time, and indeed, Andrew Corrigan just shared with us, in terms of how to use new technology like Copilot to, in terms of audit context. Just wondering if you could share with your experience with audit committees how technology can enhance the function of the audit committee or its capabilities.
Kick off perhaps. To be honest, I haven't seen, so there's been a lot of talk around the use of data analysis, and I think in most areas technology has moved way faster than what organisations can keep up with, right? Deb and Daniel will remember the days of Colin talking about data analytics as it relates to payroll, fraud, etc. And I haven't seen an agency, implement, that type of analysis well. I think all agencies are grappling with, the use of technology to assist with, and so I think the focus has been on assisting agencies with their frontline businesses, and often technology to support kind of the back end or corporate functions hasn't really kept up. It would be my observation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Certainly the example about analytics, and there was discussion for a few years about how you can bring that into the information that's presented to committees. As Fung said, I don't think I've seen a particularly great example of that. It is, and it comes back to it's the underlying systems that you need in place. It's also the cost around some of those. So I think the focus probably in a number of committees that I've seen has been more on how do they manage the technology risk from the operational systems and how is that being managed by the organisation, because that's where the money, the effort has gone initially, is to the more operational systems. So that's where the risk has tended to be and where the investment's been.
One comment I'd just make generally about technology, I'm not going to talk about it in terms of the audit function, although I do think the introduction of shared services and the fact that, when I say introduction, it's been around a long time, but now in terms of transactions and doing data analytics, you're really relying on shared services to do that. And I think the growing scam issue and the threat of scams, again, agencies are going to have to work with shared services very closely on that, because that's an emerging issue that we're all facing personally, but also we're facing in terms of government agencies. But one of the differences between large agencies and small agencies that I've seen is a lot of the larger agencies do have a cyber and security committee, and that makes it a lot easier when you're on the audit and risk committee, because you just have to know that, say there is going to be a review of cyber and there's going to be all these people there that know all about, because if you've ever read any of those reports, but you just have to know that work's being done, because there is a cyber, and the key focus is all cyber protective security, the attestations, the thing that man spoke about this morning, they're on that. And at the audit committee, you just get the high level kind of findings of that. Whereas in a smaller agency, there generally isn't the resource to split that off. So,
Excellent. Got probably time for one more question from the back, or two more questions, pointing at each other.
I'm from the art gallery. I'm sort of picking up on a couple of strands. You've most recently mentioned shared services. I mean, for some of these organisations, we're actually not responsible on our own for risk and for handling a range of risk-related issues because of our particular relationship with the government. So, for instance, in the art gallery, and it's not confidential, I don't think, that we get recurrently, year after year, certain issues that are raised in our risk analysis and are then confirmed by the auditor, but we can't actually resolve them because they involve resources and decisions being made by parts of government which are not under our control. So I'm fascinated to know, how do the people who are responding to the material that we put through deal with situations where you've clearly got shared responsibilities from different arms of government and an organisation which in its legislation says it's responsible for managing the asset, in our case, an very valuable art collection, but we don't control expenditure on the building. So if we haven't got storage or we haven't got safe roofing and we've got leaks, that isn't actually something that we can fix. So, I mean, I know that because I've been chair of this committee for a while, I know what the audit reports say, but I'm just interested to know how does the audit office sort of its oversight role deal with those sorts of situations where you've clearly got diverse responsibilities by a number of different agencies, none of which any of us can control. How do you perceive that? Now, I'm sure that happens in larger organisations, but it's particularly an issue with smaller organisations with very limited resources under their own control.
And the simple answer from my perspective to that is we continue to call it out, we continue to talk about it in reports so that I suppose, discharging my fundamental role, bringing it to the attention of Parliament, bringing it to the attention of the people who can command those sort of decisions is where the space I find myself in. Obviously, I'm not in the position either to change the resourcing myself, but my role fundamentally is to call that out to Parliament and to bring it to the attention of the people who do make the decisions. And we will continue to do that, recognising, of course, that you can't necessarily change your building, but we can try and influence.
Good morning. David Powell. I'm from DHUD and ISA. About 5 years ago, I chaired a group that developed the whole of government risk management strategy. We used a bunch of risk practitioners across government, but effectively they were all the major agencies, the big ones. And just an observation that I think risk management in the smaller agencies is quite patchy because often you don't have your own risk manager or whatever. And I think that's a bit of a challenge for the smaller agencies when you're on the Audit and Risk Committee. I was just wondering whether you'd considered whether the government's actually, well, I'm not sure who would do it, but considered some sort of service provision in government to assist the smaller agencies. And I guess the model I might point to, you might be aware the local government risk services are doing something similar for the 68 agencies, 68 councils across the state. And just wondering if there's any thoughts about that, because I feel that the risk management in smaller agencies is not to standard at the moment.
I can take my Auditor General hat off for a second and go back 10 years when I was looking after SAFA, and Kevin would recognise this as well. SAFA obviously looks after SACORP, the state's insurer. There was a lot of work done back both when Kevin and I were involved in SAFA in looking at what sort of whole of government risk management service could be provided by SAFA. Invariably you end up in the space where you have to stick to your druthers, I suppose, and focus on sort of significant insurance risks. So you don't quite get there with that, but that's probably the closest I've seen in my time in government to sort of the government contemplating a whole of government risk management service. And I know they've certainly done some further work in that area, but it still doesn't quite get there. I recognise that.
I'd just like to comment and say that I don't know of many people in government that just have that role of risk manager. I think that was a position that was around when Fung and I met 20 years ago. There was a risk manager in Attorney General's, but today there would not be someone called that. And a lot of that has gone to the private providers where agencies are getting in their internal auditor to do annual work on what the strategic risks are, and then someone else that's got a broader role keeps those risks up to reviews operational and business risk. But you're right, in the smaller agencies, that probably isn't getting done as diligently as when everyone had risk managers. But by and large, I think that sort of focus has gone out of jobs. I don't know, Fung might want to comment. And it's more now sort of a governance role or a governance assurance role, and it's got a broader, it does a lot of these attestations and other things that are required.
It's almost an embedded or perhaps a desirable embedded skill set in executive roles rather than a discrete function. But yeah, I'd agree, Deb. I think even large agencies don't have risk management functions or teams. They're embedded now in governance. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very conscious that we've snuck over time. Thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you very much to my fellow panel members. It's been, from my perspective, it's been a concept that's worked reasonably well, and but we're certainly keen to get your feedback when we send out our feedback forms as to what's worked this morning, what hasn't worked. Again, thank you for your attendance. I look forward to continuing to engage with you as we move forward into this audit year, and wish you well in your audit committees. Thank you very much.